Absolute horror show that the Conservatives have inflicted on working people in this country, on our public services, on anybody paying a mortgage. Every one of them has been punished by the incompetence of the Conservative government.
That is more money for Scotland's NHS, schools and other vital public services. The fact is that this is an incompetent SNP government that is bad with taxpayers' money. So more of the same won't cut it.
I tell you what, John Swinney's got some front. The man whose dirty fingerprints are all over the tram scandal, the ferry scandal, the Salmond inquiry scandal, the named persons scandal. How much has this man's mistakes cost all of us?
The Steamie Politics Podcast from the Scotsman.
Hello and welcome to the Steamie, the politics podcast from the Scotsman. World leaders are gathering in the chilly Alps and politics this week is focused on the frozen Arctic, but that has not stopped Scottish politicians landing themselves in hot water. I'm Rachel Amery, the Scotsman's political correspondent, and joining me to talk about all of that, from the Scottish hospital scandal in Holyrood to defence and international diplomacy, I am joined by Deputy Political Editor David Ball and Westminster Correspondent Andrew Quinn. Now, there's been a lot happening this week on the international stage, but before we take a look at all of that, because there's a lot to get through, we're going to have a look at the Scottish Hospitals inquiry. That's very much what the focus of Holyrood has been this week. So just a quick recap as to what's happened there. In the past week, NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde admitted there was a link between contaminated water at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital. I'm sure you've all heard of the super hospital in Glasgow. You've probably driven past it as well. It's quite an imposing building on the skyline there. So the link between the contaminated water there and infections in children with cancer. Now, very tragically, multiple children have died because of these infections. So it's quite a serious issue that we've been discussing this week in Holyrood. We've also heard that the Health Board's told a public inquiry that the hospital opened too early because of safety concerns. So that's now turned into questions as to who knew what, when did they know it, and was there political pressure from the Scottish Government to get this hospital opened on time to make them look good? That's basically what we're having to peel back in all of this when we're looking at this. So fingers have been pointed a lot at First Minister John Swinney and his predecessor Nicola Sturgeon, and that is what has dominated First Minister's questions on Thursday. So David, I mean, is this a big problem for John Swinney? I mean, this was what dominated First Minister's questions. Labour have been on at him for years about this. The Conservatives have had a go at him this week as well about it. Does he know more than he's letting on, do you think? Or is this not a big a deal? What was your thoughts there?
Well, John Swinney was trying to kind of brush this under the carpet and insinuate that no pressure was put on and politicians have done nothing wrong. But it's one of those things that politicians often hope go away and that won't come back. But as you mentioned, this has been kind of hanging around, the stench of this, for a long time for the SNP government. Anna Sarwar was bringing it up before he was even Labour leader as a backbench MSP. He's really been banging the drum about this, and the admission this week has kind of sparked a bit of a fuse where that anger has been kind of directed at the Health Board, which it looks very apparent there's lots of questions for them to answer, but also what this government knew. And they were obviously involved in that flagship hospital being opened. I do think from First Minister's questions, one thing that John Swinney was asked directly, did your government put pressure on the board to open it on time? And he said flatly no. But there's no answer to who did put pressure on the Health Board to open it before it was ready. And after FMQs, the Scottish Government sort of have a little briefing with journalists about some of these topics, and were asked about this and basically said that will come out in the inquiry. But we know from these public inquiries that it can take months, even years, for any answers, particularly to these kind of grieving families. So it's quite an emotive one. It's unlikely to go away anytime soon. And ahead of the election, I think both Labour and the Tories, as we saw today, will really be pressing it against the SNP and putting them under pressure over it. I mean, you covered it at FNQ today. What did you think to John Swinney's kind of response to a lot of that?
Yeah, one thing that I thought was quite interesting was the fact that when he was asked, did you do this? He just stood up, said no, and sat back down. It's quite unusual to see that kind of like impactfulness in a statement from the First Minister. Normally we get lots of long ramblings a lot of speaking without a lot of actually saying a lot much, if that makes sense as well. So to actually see him just saying no and sit back down was, and you could see it kind of took the wind out of the sail. I think it was Russell Finlay he was replying to at this point. It did kind of take the wind out of his sails a little bit there. So I suppose that kind of worked for the First Minister there at that point. It's difficult to see how it's going to go away though. I mean, we're recording this on Thursday afternoon, and we know that Friday lunchtime, Anna Sarwar is due to hold a press conference in Edinburgh with some of the families affected by it. And this is, when we're looking at it as a story point of view from journalists, I mean, it's the families that are the ones who the story is about. They're the ones that have like the emotive story behind all of this. So it's going to be quite interesting to see how that press conference goes, because I can imagine it's going to be quite an emotional one, and quite difficult to sort of hear what they have to say and things like that too. So that's another sort of sign that the politicians don't want to let this problem go. We do have, I think I'm right in saying that tomorrow might be about 100 days to go until the election. We're certainly coming up to the 100-day mark, regardless of which day it is exactly. And when we're seeing the polls, we know that Labour and the Conservatives are really, really dropping in the polls right now. The SNP they're not comfortably ahead in the front, but they're still looking like they will remain the largest party in Scotland at the moment, at this point in time. So for Labour and the Conservatives, this does seem like an issue that they probably want to keep a hold of. But as you were saying, public inquiries can go on for a very, very, very long time. John Swinney today saying, look, we need to wait and see what happens, what comes out of the inquiry and things like that. And we're unlikely to get any answers on that before the election in May. So it kind of works for both parties, both sides of the argument as to how they're going to play it. The SNP can kind of not hide, but they can kind of get away with saying, look, ongoing public inquiry going on, we need to wait for that to happen. Whereas the opposition parties can say, we want answers now, we're not getting answers, and here's who we think is to blame. So it's going to be an interesting one to see how much this plays on politicians when it comes to the campaigning. I mean, this is not, I live on the East Coast, so I don't have any sort of involvement beyond visiting this hospital for politics things. I mean, David, communities in Glasgow and communities in the west of Scotland, this must be like a big problem for them, because this is obviously a hospital they would have to use regularly.
Yeah, as you mentioned, you can't miss it. You drive past it; it's gigantic, and people know it. People get sent there even for all parts of that part of Scotland. So it is an emotive issue, and politically, Glasgow is going to be a huge battleground in the Holyrood election between the SNP and Labour. Labour basically wiped out the SNP in the general election, the Westminster one in 2024. All the polls indicate that could be completely reversed, but they're very marginal. Some of these seats, when Labour won that overwhelming victory in Scotland in 2024, a lot of them are still quite marginal. So there's a lot of leeway, and if Labour can kind of ramp up some of that anger, among with this narrative that the NHS hasn't been fixed under the SNP, it could be quite an effective tool. And they're quite desperate, given the polling, to try anything that they can to kind of do that. But locally and in Glasgow, there'll be a lot of anger about this. There has been for years. The fact that there's been no answers for families for, a humongous amount of time. I think this week's admission from the board in their evidence that there is a potential link is probably upset a lot of people, quite rightly, and Labour will try and take full advantage of that if they can.
I mean, Andrew, just saying there that quite close to this election now, particularly for Labour, is this issue on its own enough to turn their political fortunes around in time, do you think? Or is that ship long gone for them?
Yeah, I'm not sure that the QUH will turn it on its own. I mean, it could be quite interesting for, I guess, the seats in that area, as David's saying, though, particularly in that kind of southwest Glasgow sort of area. That's always very close between Labour and the SNP. And like in 2017, when the SNP held the seat, Labour gained a few. The SNP held it, I think, by 60 votes. So it shows just how close things can be there. So we'll see. I mean, Labour are trying to make the NHS the big issue. I mean, polls in general have shown that the NHS is probably the most important issue to the Scottish public. So this helps Labour in that sense. Will it do it on its own? I would say no. But it definitely gives them a hand. Like, it kind of plays up to the whole thing that our NHS is crumbling. I think a big issue with the QUH as well is I think a lot of people in the west of Scotland, I'm from Paisley and I'm only 2 miles down the road or whatever from the QUH. A lot of people were upset that other hospitals were closed or had their reduced capacity for that at the time. So the Western Infirmary is completely gone in the West End of Glasgow, and it was bought over by Glasgow Uni. They knocked it down. And there's whole new buildings there, and the Victoria as well in the south side of Glasgow. That it's still there, but it's not as big a hospital as it once was because everything was concentrated in the QUH. So there were controversial elements about it already. I'm not sure everyone supported the idea of having a super hospital rather than these smaller local ones. So it's perhaps something Labour can use to their advantage, and we'll see Anas Sarwar will be doing that with his press conference with the families.
Yes, certainly lots to think about there. I think the parties will definitely want to hold on to this in the election campaign. But we need to move on to the international stage. It's been very hard to keep on track of what exactly has been happening this week because it's been changing so fast. So I said earlier, we're recording this on Thursday afternoon because there's a good chance that if you're listening to this later on in the weekend or for example, that things might have changed all over again. But at this point in time, we had Donald Trump saying that he was going to impose tariffs on the UK and others because the UK and others were opposing his plans to take over Greenland. He also said he wasn't going to rule out using force, for example, to take over that territory. He criticised the UK government for handing over sovereignty of the Chagos Islands. He then backtracked on his tariff plan. And earlier today at the World Economic Forum in Davos, he and other nations signed a new Board of Peace treaty. Now, I'll point out here at this point in time, the UK has refused to sign this Board of Peace treaty because there's still a bit of uncertainty as to how involved the Russian President Vladimir Putin is in all of this. I think at the moment as well, no members of the UN Security Council have signed this deal either. So lots happening, lots to have a discussion about here. But of course, all does have an impact on Keir Starmer. There's been a lot of discussion, particularly on the Chagos Islands, and was he right to oppose the president on this? Has he handled it well? Andrew, you're in Westminster. How has this all gone down for Keir Starmer? Has he come out well out of all of this?
Yeah, I think Trump's really pushing him to the limit, isn't he? The PM's been trying his best to be like, oh yeah, we're still pals with America, we're pals with Europe. He's been trying his best to. Well, sitting on the fence is probably right. Perhaps a little bit harsh, but he's been trying to play both sides, hasn't he? He's been trying to act like, he's Trump's pal, and he's this great Trump whisperer. That's been the whole thing. But really, he's Trump's testing him for sure. I mean, putting on these extra tariffs really didn't look good for the UK, particularly. We think about Scottish industries, Scotch whisky, Scottish salmon, they're two huge exports to the US. It would have a massive impact on those industries, but on the whole UK economy. So it really, really wouldn't be good if we did get more tariffs. I think what's quite telling is actually those industries haven't commented as well on it. They're wary of saying too much. I think they're kind of waiting to see what happens because you can't take Trump at his word always. But I actually think the PM dealt with it relatively well because he was quite calm, and he was like, he had a presser on Monday, which I was watching, and he was saying how really we need calm heads just now, we need cool heads. We can't just react with retaliatory tariffs, which seemed like the right move, but then obviously we got the Chagos criticism. And I mean, I thought again, it was probably the first time Starmer had kind of stood up to Trump. I thought he did quite well. He was like, Trump's just saying this because he wants Greenland and we're not letting him have it. Which I thought it's right, isn't it? Trump was using him for criticism. So I think the PM's done okay so far. We're not going to sign up to this Board of Peace. Which is essentially like a new kind of UN, it seems. But the main concern is that Russia's been invited to be part of it, and the UK is very much against the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So that's going to make it very difficult. it makes it's a really tough time for the PM, these international issues, but it's probably where he looks a bit better than what he does domestically. Probably seems more comfortable. But yeah, I mean, the highlight of the whole week was Trump's 90-minute long press conference at Davos. I mean, it was quite crazy, really. Like it was hard to follow at times as well, and I think that's because he goes off script so often, and he was quite insulting, really, to a lot of European leaders. And he seemed to just take delight in the fact that he said, we're not going to use force. And he was like, oh, there you go. That's what you've all been waiting for, that sort of thing. So it was really quite bizarre. Probably at the moment it's working out okay for the UK, but I think we're going to hit an inflection point at some time where we really need to choose, are we with Trump or are we against him? And I can't imagine that the UK is going to be on the side of Trump, really. If, say, it's Trump or Europe, we all know Keir Starmer was against Brexit. He probably wants closer ties with the EU. I can imagine he'd go that way either. It might open up a real dividing line as well. We think about between Labour and Reform, Labour and the Tories as well. And it's something that the PM could use to his advantage. He could be like, well, actually, I stand up for Britain, whereas Reform want to let Donald Trump dominate our politics. So it could be spun in that way. I guess we'll see over the next while. But obviously, we've got Donald Trump as the US president for another 3 years to go. So there's so much that could happen between now and then.
Yeah, this speech in Davos, because I think there's a few times as well where he mistook Greenland for Iceland and said Iceland a few times as well. I think it was quite funny because there's an Icelandic comedian that I follow on Instagram, and so he was having a whale of a time last night posting videos being like, don't worry, you're not the first person to mix it all up and everything like that. So I'm sure there's a few people having a few giggles at the end of that particular one there. Something else that's happening today in Westminster, and we were just talking about this before we came onto the podcast, Andrew. Andy Burnham, is he a step closer to being Prime Minister? Is this what's happening there?
Yeah, so one of the former Labour MPs, Andrew Quinn, he has reportedly reached an agreement where he'll be able to retire from Parliament now. Last year, he had been suspended from Labour because of offensive comments he'd made in a private WhatsApp chat. Now, he had been a relatively big figure. He'd been I think he was in Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet. He'd been a government minister previously. So he'd been quite a big figure, but his seat is in Greater Manchester, and it seems that he's managed to come to an agreement with the Houses of Parliament or House of Commons authorities that he will get his proper pension because he'll be able to retire on sickness. So his seat's, in Greater Manchester. So some people have been speculating for quite a while that would allow Andy Burnham, current Mayor of Greater Manchester, to return to Parliament. Now, we had around conference time last year, so in September, Andy Burnham had given a couple of interviews, kind of criticising the UK government, and I think he wouldn't be anywhere near it at all if the government was perceived to be doing well and if it hadn't annoyed so many of its own MPs. But the issue is that Keir Starmer is really, really unpopular, but there's perhaps no clear alternative on the left of the party, or on the soft left of the party. Angela Rayner is one who's been often touted as a potential successor, but she had to leave government kind of in disgrace. She hadn't paid part of her tax when buying a new flat. So Burnham is hoping Burnham is potentially hoping he can come back in. It's quite interesting. He's lost 2 Labour leadership contests. He lost in 2010, 2015. He didn't even come close in either of them. So maybe he's hoping third time lucky. But I think what's been really interesting is I've been speaking to a lot of Scottish Labour MPs today about it, and most of them don't want Andy Burnham to come in. I don't know whether they're politically opposed to him. They all seem to be saying that it would damage Scottish Labour's prospects at the Holyrood election. Now, that may be some spin, maybe some truth in it. The main argument goes it's a distraction. It takes away from us being able to criticise the SNP. That's what the Scottish Labour folks say. But they're also saying it would actually take away resources because there would need to be a Greater Manchester mayoral election as well. So it could be quite a big deal. It's just funny because it comes at a time when probably things were a bit more stable for Keir Starmer, and then more issues come up again. So we'll see. I think, though, among the Labour MPs who don't brief out that they hate Burnham and it would be ridiculous, there's probably a fair bit of sympathy towards him. We think about the MPs that rebelled against the welfare cuts. A lot of them would probably quite like this soft left Labour person, a bit more traditional Labour, who isn't going to go to war with their own MPs. And I mean, I've already spoken to one MP who was like, we definitely need to get Burnham in. So it shows that some of them definitely do support him or would support him. Whether say he becomes an MP, which isn't even a foregone conclusion because the party needs to let him stand, which might not happen. They might block him, which I don't think would look very good. But even if he becomes an MP, it might be quite difficult for him to get enough support to become leader. So there's a whole host of things that would need to happen if he were to become PM. But I think it wouldn't look very good probably from Labour to block him. It would look like a sign of weakness, really, that the Prime Minister can't see off this potential challenger. And also someone who, in the media, is one of their strongest performers. So, yeah, there's never a dull moment. And, yeah, just when Keir Starmer thinks he's back on track, he gets presented with another issue to deal with. But, yeah, it's definitely one to watch for. We should hear a bit more about Andrew Gwynn's resignation over the next couple of days. And then we'll see if Andy Burnham's going for it.
So let's put you on the spot there. Who's going to be Prime Minister this time next year? Will it be Andy Burnham or will it be somebody else? Wes Streeting maybe, or Angela Rayner, as you were saying?
Yeah, that sounds crazy, but I'm actually going to say Keir Starmer will stay in a job. It's not that I think things won't go badly in May. I think they will go, particularly in Wales, probably in Scotland, unless something dramatic happens. But there's no clear coalescence around another candidate at the moment, and I think that would be the issue. I can see a way in which Keir Starmer stays on as PM until the next general election, and it's partly because of the lack of big figures in strong positions to take him on.
What about you, David? If you were a betting man, who's going to be Prime Minister this time next year?
It's hard to tell because these things, once momentum gets into them and people want rid of someone, it kind of builds. We saw it with the Tories, and I do think there's probably a conscious effort on a lot of Labour MPs don't want to repeat the kind of chaos we saw after Boris Johnson was kind of dragged kicking and screaming from down the street. So I do think there will be a conscious effort from some who maybe would like to get rid of him, might kind of hold their tongues. Andy Burnham would be an asset to Labour in the long term, looking ahead to the next UK general election. As Andrew said, he's one of their best sort of media performers. I do think Labour lacks sort of big characters that people relate to, that feel like a traditional Labour voter. Angela Rayner is the obvious one, but as we mentioned, there's some issues bringing her back to the front of it, and I think he would fit that bill very well. He's very popular, not just in the party, like across the board, so it would be an asset to get him in the Commons for them. But yeah, Wales is going to get lost by Labour. They're going to lose Wales. They're going to lose badly in England. Again, it looks like disaster in Scotland maybe, but will it spark enough for them to actually put their foot forward and try and get rid of him? I don't know. I would be surprised if it was a quick thing, but there's a long time till the next general election, so we'll just have to wait and see whether Labour think he's the problem and can kind of pin a lot of the issues on Starmer and send him on his way. But it will get very messy if that happens, and it's probably not going to help their polling, particularly in the short term. So it is a big risk if they do try and actually get rid of him.
I think probably the bigger risk comes from the Labour right rather than the Labour left. Now, we look at, there was a story a while back about Scottish Labour MPs were plotting to oust Starmer. Now, the names that get bandied about aren't the ones that are on the left. It's actually ones who politically would agree with the PM. So that's maybe his biggest risk, is that he loses support of those who were his most fervent backers before. And I think actually should probably worry less about Burnham and worry a bit more about those who say they're loyal to him.
Oh, that's a very interesting point there. There's one last thing we want to talk about before we wrap up for the week. David, you earlier on today, you're meeting Defence Secretary John Healey. He was in Edinburgh because he's been announcing this brand new contract for Typhoon jets. Looks like it's going to secure about 300 jobs. But what was really interesting is you were telling me you had a bit of a blast from the past with all of this. A good old-fashioned rammy has happened. So do you want to tell us what's happened there?
Yeah, so John Healey, the UK Defence Secretary, fresh from being in Copenhagen yesterday, was up in Edinburgh announcing this kind of contract at Leonardo's for them to kind of upgrade radar systems on Typhoons, which are kind of one of the most used and most famous of the British fighter jets. But he was asked about the SNP and the Scottish Government's kind of role in defence, and obviously most of it is reserved, but there's been a bit of tension there because John Swinney has been a bit annoyed that the UK government has kind of bypassed the Scottish government in the operation we saw by the US forces in seizing the Russian oil tanker. They used Wick Airport to kind of a lot of the US jets to be based at during the operation. It's currently in Scottish waters, the tanker, and there have been concerns about the fact that Scots law was kind of involved here a little bit and whether that had been adhered to. And the Lord Advocate maybe had a stake in what was happening with that tanker. But there's been a bit of a row with the UK government, which we've not really seen with the Labour government. It was very much something we were very used to when the Tories were in power. It was almost for fun and for sport that the two governments would have a row. But so this has kind of erupted because he got asked about the Scottish government's role, and basically accused them of their nuclear deterrent, their stance on that, the Scottish government, which is to oppose it, basically jeopardising national security. So I asked John Healey about this is John Healey saying what he had to say on John Swinney, and then I asked John Swinney after FMQs his response to that. That was John Swinney there, just addressing that and disputing the fact that the SNP's kind of position puts national security at risk. He then waded further into this kind of war with Douglas Alexander, who he's come in quite recently as Scottish Secretary, and he's obviously not warmed the heart of John Swinney because John Swinney kind of wrote to Keir Starmer about all this. Why are we not being told about it? And instead of Keir Starmer replying, Douglas Alexander thought he would reply instead and basically told him it's nothing to do with you. This is on a need-to-know basis, and basically you don't get to be told about any of this, which I can kind of see some sympathy from John Swinney because you would expect them in some capacity, obviously not everything, to be told what was happening in Scottish waters and at airports in Scotland. But he's kind of had a bit more dialogue with John Swinney, but he's accused Douglas Alexander of being juvenile. And it's just a bit of a mess over something quite serious. And it doesn't really, as is always the case with these things, never makes anyone look very good. I don't know what will happen next, but it's quite clear that the UK government are just playing the card that we're in charge here. This is a reserve matter, and it's too important to involve the devolved government. Whether there's politics at play, there clearly is with the election looming, but we've not seen a proper row between the two governments over something really silly like briefings in a long time, and long may it continue.
Always good fun for us to watch that. That is all we've got time for this week, so thank you very much for listening. Thank you to Andrew down in Westminster, David up here in Holyrood, and to our producer Kelly as well. We'll be back next week with more, but in the meantime, keep an eye on the Scotsman's website for all the latest comment and analysis throughout the week. Speak to you soon.